We have to confront evil because it's got nothing to do with politics. It's about how people treat each other and how people have treated each other in history.
Hi, I'm Justine.
And I'm Daryl.
And we're the Breakaway Bravehearts. And today we're in Bristol with Rob Collin on his Bristol Slave Trade Walk.
If we're going to understand our present, we have to understand our past. The history of the transatlantic slave trade is embedded silently all around us. It doesn't shout out at us.
Today's video is a little bit different from our usual social tourism reviews. Rob's tour was incredibly detailed and covered an enormous amount of important historical information. So we've split our review into two parts. This video is part one, where we look at the silent, darker half of the history and delve into the link between Bristol City, its people, and the transatlantic slave trade.
For Rob, this is not just about events and dates, this is about morality and human nature, and it began at the beginning of Bristol.
I wanted to talk about Bristol as a port 1,000 years, but it helped to explain why Bristol came to participate in the transatlantic slave trade. So Bristol started as a settlement 10th century, 900s, at the junction of two rivers, the Bristol Avon and its tributary, the River Frome. Now, our early trade in Bristol was wool, so we exported wool and leather to Ireland. We imported animal skins and fish, but we also transported enslaved whites to Southern Ireland. Now, slavery was part of Saxon England. One historian I've read refers to up to 9% of the Saxon population being enslaved. So there was a white slave traffic from Bristol to Southern Ireland because the colonists in Southern Ireland, the Vikings, wanted young men and young women as servants and farm labourers. Now, this was a practice brought to an end by the Normans in about 1090, but largely through the efforts of a cleric, Bishop Wulfstan. He was the Bishop of Worcester.
Bristol branched out into other trade areas and international ports, and the city grew quickly, diverting its rivers, expanding its ports, building more bridges, and becoming increasingly industrialized. We pick up where Bristol has become a major international port, but as a result of war is about to have to rethink its global trade.
After 1247, remember this would have been unusual, a finger of shipping.
Yeah.
From the Avon, going up the Frome to the old town of Bristol, a finger of shipping.
Yeah.
So unusual. So if you go back to 1247, heart of our docks, our main trading partner was Bordeaux in southwest France.
Okay.
And remained so right up until 1453,
Wow.
which was the 100 Years' War with France, the end of the 100 Years' War with France, where England's largely expelled, removed from France. Importantly, with England removed from France, Bristol still trades with Bordeaux, but it's French controlled. So our ships can be seized. So Bristol now takes a step to look towards Spain and Portugal from the 1460s. We export high quality cloth. We import again wine, olive oil, dried fruit, salt. But most importantly, we now base our agents and merchants in Seville in Spain and Lisbon in Portugal. And it's our links with commerce and trade which has driven us in Bristol, which is also why we've entered difficult history. We're now watching the Portuguese and Spanish in their early commercial exploration. We have a ringside seat. This is not England, this is Bristol. And that's the important thing to get across. So the Portuguese start going down the coast of West Africa in the 1430s, and they are after sub-Saharan gold. So it's what took all Europeans to West Africa, gold. Gold and ivory, but primarily gold. And a decade later, the 1440s, they become involved in the slave trade. They continued down the coast of West Africa, and then Bartholomew Dias in 1487 rounds the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean. Mm-hmm. And the Portuguese now want the spice trade in the Far East, the spice trade. And it's doubly important because 1453, that the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople. So the Ottoman Turks now hold the land route, control the land route into Europe from the Far East. So the Portuguese definitely need that sea route. The Spanish also want the spice trade. Mm-hmm. And under King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, they sponsor Columbus. Mm-hmm. So Columbus in 1492 arrives in the Caribbean. He thinks he's arrived in the Indies. Now, in Bristol, we have our own expeditions. So we're watching the Portuguese, we're watching the Spanish, but we have our own expeditions into the North Atlantic. Now, this then introduces John Cabot to the subject.
So Bristol commissioned John Cabot to help them find new trading opportunities. And in 1497, he set off to find the Isle of Brazil, which was said to have this famous Brazilwood tree, which produced a particular red dye that was very profitable at the time. Cabot actually had a side mission. He was trying to get to China and Japan so he could get his hands on some jewels. But in your classic blunder of 15th century explorers, he ended up in Canada, Newfoundland to be exact. And he never actually found the fabulous Isle of Brazil because it didn't actually exist.
John Cabot is not a success story. He had found land, he'd found a lot of fish, so we weren't that interested. We did have other expeditions by Bristol merchants after Cabot, which go right up until 1508. They did not find Japanese or Chinese civilization or commercial opportunities. In 1508, we called it a day. No opportunities other than fish. We called it a day. We then have a hiatus of 100 years, and then we come to the important period.
By the early 1600s, England had started its colonies in the Americas, and the tobacco trade takes flight, sparking consumer-driven slave trade and bringing growth and wealth to England. Bristol, wanting to cash in on this booming business, made sure that it got a piece of the pie.
That early cash crop, tobacco. By 1660, tobacco was accounting for a third of our import trade in Bristol. And then in the 1640s, in the English Caribbean, cane sugar cultivation came to supplant or replace tobacco cultivation in the English Caribbean. And then Bristol became an important refining centre for sugar. So we had 10 sugar refineries by 1695, 20 sugar refineries by 1760. So sugar became the number one import into Bristol in value, as it had become the number one import in value into Britain in the 18th century. So when you get to 1700, Bristol population was 20,000 about. By 1800, Bristol 68,000. In 1698, Bristol legally joins the slave trade by Act of Parliament. Now, to understand that, you go back to 1660, a royal chartered company called the Royal Adventurers of England trading to Africa. Now, in 1660, the African trade was largely gold and ivory, but also included dyewood and the slave trade. Now, the slave trade, they estimate, accounted for about a quarter of their overall trade. The Royal African Company, of which Edward Colston is associated, was then founded in 1672. Its governor was James, Duke of York, after whom New York is named, the later James II of England. But under their leadership, the slave trade, the trafficking of enslaved Africans, became the dominant part of their trade, with the result that ports like Bristol and other towns in England petitioned Parliament and said, we want a part of the African trade. It's not right that it should be the monopoly of the Royal African Company. And in the end, 1698, Parliament obliges, agrees, which means that ports like Bristol and then later Liverpool can now freely engage in the slave trade without fear of their ships being seized by the Royal Navy. Now, so the official start date for the slave trade in Bristol, 1698. Unofficially, engaging in the slave trade as early as 1662. We now get to ask the question, why then did Bristol participate in the transatlantic slave trade?
Such questions are never easy to answer, and there are a few more pieces of the puzzle to understand. There were a couple of moments in Rob's talk that were really light bulb moments for me. One was when he explained the slave economy. It helped me see the bigger picture.
To understand the subject in a much wider context, I approached Dr. Richard Stone at the University of Bristol, and he said to understand the subject in a much wider context, you need to understand the term slave economy. And he gave me a definition, and the definition he provided was Britain's slave economy related to, this is the first part of the definition, Britain's slave economy related to everyone who benefited from the enslavement of Africans. Everyone who benefited from the enslavement of Africans. Now, if you go to the 18th century and you consider the three new mass-consumed drinks of tea, coffee and cocoa, they were all taken and sweetened with slave-produced sugar. Yes, absolutely. So you're starting to widen the narrative to not just considering London, Bristol and Liverpool, but to now considering all of Britain and all those who drank the three new drinks of tea, coffee and cocoa Why? Because they were all taken and sweetened with slave-produced sugar. But it also introduces another narrative, which is of the role of consumers in the transatlantic slave trade.
Hearing about the idea of the slave economy really made me be more mindful about my own purchases. I have to think as a consumer, what are my choices contributing to? Rob explained it all began with tobacco.
Now, if you go to the 1570s, the smoking of tobacco as a habit was introduced into England by they believe, Sir John Hawkins of Plymouth, so cousin to Sir Francis Drake. Now, he had led the first English slaving expeditions to modern-day Sierra Leone in the 1560s and had transported enslaved Africans from modern-day Sierra Leone to the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, particularly Hispaniola. So that's modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But it's believed he then brought back the smoking of tobacco as a habit, as smoked by the Amerindians, to England in the 1570s. And it was then popularized at the English court, the court of Elizabeth I, by Sir Walter Raleigh. So by the end of the 1500s, tobacco was being imported from Spain into England or smuggled into England as contraband from modern-day Venezuela. Now, as England goes into the 1600s, we start to see the development of English settlements in the early 1600s in the Americas. Now, tobacco seeds from Spanish Trinidad were introduced into Virginia in 1612. 9-month growing cycle, then sold in England the following year. It was an immediate success in 1613. This led to an explosion of tobacco cultivation in Virginia. It also led the new English settlers to Bermuda, who settled after 1609, to St. Kitts, to Nevis, to Barbados, to Antigua, to Montserrat, and Maryland, to the north of Virginia, all using tobacco cultivation as their cash crop to prosper as a settlement. They all use tobacco cultivation. Now, there's an historian I've read called, his name is Jordan Goodman, but in his book, Tobacco in History, he provides a very compelling argument whereby he says, no tobacco, no English-American colonies. To which I'd add the corollary and say, no English-American colonies and no English slave trade. Now, the second part of the definition of slave economies, the slave ship builders, the merchants who victualled or supplied the slave ships, the rope makers, the sail makers, the merchants who manufactured the trade goods which went out to West Africa, the guns, the brass pots, the copper vessels, to trade for, to exchange for enslaved Africans. The slave ship owners who then acquired the enslaved Africans in West Africa. The English plantation owners in the English Americas who then bought the enslaved Africans and then sold their produce, sugar, tobacco, cotton, cocoa, rice, as part of what became known as the triangular trade. The merchants in England who imported these plantation crops. The marine insurers, the bankers, all these persons I've spoken about are all part of the slave economy in Britain. So with this definition in mind, slave economy, the door was being opened to me by Dr. Richard Stone to better understand all of Britain was complicit, either directly or through slave trading. Primary ports were London, Bristol, Liverpool, but then the rest of Britain indirectly complicit through the operation of the slave economy in Britain, the commerce, the triangular trade. So if you've come from Birmingham or some village in Yorkshire, look at your history. Did you supply in Yorkshire hats for the enslaved on the plantations? Yeah. Did you in Scotland and Ireland provide fish for the enslaved on the plantations? To accept that in Britain and Ireland, we're all complicit. And once you work from that side, then you can start to say, right, this is a tough subject. Yeah, this potentially involves me.
We can't help but think of modern parallels and wonder at how slow we are at making change in our society. I mean, think about fast fashion. Our demand for cheap clothes often drives exploitative labour. Or even electronics, where the mining of materials can involve forced labour and environmental harm. It's kind of eye-opening to consider how our everyday choices are impacting on these issues.
I agree completely, but there's more to this story. Creating a consumer market is one thing, but then to think it's okay to supply it with goods produced at the cost of human lives is a completely different thing altogether. How was it that Britain was happy to use slave labour to fill its shelves?
To answer that, of course, is complicated and twisty. It involves an already established practice of shipping labour, paid and unpaid, as part of regular trade. Remember those enslaved Saxons that were traded to the Vikings in Ireland? Well, although that practice was put to end by the Normans, it wasn't long before Britain was trading in unpaid labour again.
If you go to the early 1600s, Bristol became an important transport hub for the transportation of white labour out to our plantations in the Americas. So the white labour consisted of what we call indentured servants, and they signed up in theory as voluntarily. I use the word with some difficulty, being voluntarily signing up. If you've got nothing to live for in life, you might be a volunteer, but it's not really a correct assessment of your circumstances. But anyway, from a legal point of view, they're voluntary labour.
Today, a similar illegal practice of debt bondage still exists, and it's considered a form of human trafficking. But back in the 1600s, it was a brilliantly efficient way of making sure you produced enough goods to supply your wealthy customers while getting rid of your less desirable cash-strapped population.
But England also then sends out her convicts and criminals. Now, many of the indentured labour went out from Bristol. Convicts and criminals, many went out from Bristol to the plantations, but also our political dissidents. So, and the best example of that are the Irish Catholics. Now, this is all predated our involvement in the slave trade. Up to 1657, estimated up to 50,000 Irish Catholic men, women, children, all forcibly transported to the English plantations in the Americas. So Bristol, transport hub for white labour.
So basically what Rob is saying here is that Bristol was already an established port for transporting human labour. It was a routine part of daily work, and although not everyone was thrilled about it, as he would explain to us later, it was deeply ingrained in the city's culture. So naturally, when the practice of importing African slaves to work on plantations came about, the city was poised to take advantage of a booming industry.
Now, from 1619, the first enslaved Africans were accepted into Virginia to work on English plantations. With the decimation of England's population in the English Civil War, so there is a demand for more labour, which could not be met by white labour. And as England transitions from using white labour on the plantations from the 1680s to largely use enslaved African labour on the plantations in the English Americas, so Bristol transitions from being a transport hub for white labour to now becoming directly involved in the transportation of enslaved Africans.
Essentially what we have running here is two stories, one of commerce and one of morality. Rob is great at telling both, but I was still struggling to understand, how did people take the leap from transporting volunteer labour, albeit a loose definition of the word, to essentially kidnapping people from their home country, locking them in a ship and treating them worse than farm animals to benefit their own pocket? Rob explained a bit of the history around the philosophical debate that was used to justify such inhumane practices.
David Olusoga and other authors also referred to a case of a Russian slave in England in the late 1560s, the time of Elizabeth I in England, whereby at court the phrase was used for the first time, "England is too pure an air for slaves to breathe in." In 1618, an English gold trader by the name of Captain Richard Jobson in West Africa was approached by an African slave trader and offered enslaved African women for purchase. He replied, "The English do not get involved in the sale or purchase of human beings." But if you use both examples, you're starting to make a case. Perhaps at that time in England, there were many in England who abhorred the idea of slavery or of a slave trade. Then look at and answer the question, well, 1618, English do not get involved in sale or purchase of human beings. 1619, the English start to accept enslaved Africans into Virginia. So how do you explain that?
Yes.
Okay, that's a huge question, and it's something that I've been trying to read and understand. Now, this academic in Bermuda wrote to me, and he said, "Robert, I'm not a fan of the Age of Enlightenment, because the Scots go on about it as being, we believed all men were equal, etc., but they didn't. Bishop George Berkeley, I'll use the term Berkeley, very much believed that all men were equal, whatever their color, whatever their background, whatever their race. He believed all men were equal. But he accepted the fact that slavery was an institution which dated from the biblical period. So he accepted the fact that slavery just was an institution which happened to be part of, if you like, human society. With the Age of Enlightenment, which followed after the Age of Reasoning, of which Bishop George Berkeley had been a part, Age of Reasoning, was very different. The academics at that time were arguing that, yes, all men are equal, but they also came to then make the statement that in order to justify the fact that slavery was, if you like, part of society, that certain people, referring to Black Africans, were of a lesser human state than other men. So to justify the institution of slavery, they judged that all men, while saying in one phrase they're equal, but in fact, people of Black African descent arguably are of a lesser human state and therefore are not equal to all men.
All this made me question the origins of racism. I had always thought that it was the racist attitudes that were behind the slave trade in the beginning, but now I'm starting to think it was the other way around. That actually the racist attitudes that many still suffer from today are a result of trying to justify the practice of slave labour to fuel commerce in Britain. It's definitely a shift in thinking. And there was another gem that Rob gave me that shifted my thinking too. He used the term great man history, which we'll explore a bit more in part 2. And he made me realise how we are still talking about this from the white perspective.
David Olusoga said the one thing which has been erased in Bristol when it comes to history is the lives of the Africans, enslaved Africans, who were transported on Bristol ships. And over 486,000 enslaved Africans were transported on Bristol ships that actually made it to the New World. So actual transportation would have been a figure much higher than that. So we're talking about 500,000.
So despite the number of victims, finding their voices is challenging because most of the stories were told by others. But there are some accounts where Black Africans or formerly enslaved peoples have shared their experiences. Orlando Equiano was a man who was enslaved and later freed. In his autobiography, he writes, "I was soon after this put into a small boat with my fellow slaves and carried to the shore. Then transported on board the ship, and after some time I was put to work in the sugar plantations, where I laboured incessantly with little rest and worse food."
Mary Prince was an enslaved woman from Bermuda with a published autobiography detailing her life in the British Caribbean. I was employed in the sugar plantation, where I worked from early in the morning till late at night. The overseers were very harsh, and we endured many sufferings and hardships, including poor food and severe beatings.
James Williams, a former enslaved African from Jamaica, also shared his experiences. On the plantations, we were subjected to constant hard work, and the overseers showed no mercy. Our lives were a relentless cycle of toil from dawn until dusk, with only brief intervals for rest. We had to endure the heat of the sun and the cruel treatment from those in charge. The personal stories of folks like Olada, Mary and James is a brutal reality of what African slavery was like. But it's interesting to consider just how African slavery started.
But if you read, for example, Professor David Olusoga and the Europeans going to West Africa for gold originally, and then slave trade became another aspect to their commerce and trade with West Africa. But you also start to realize it was black Africans who were militarily and commercially much stronger than Europeans. They determined what was sold on the West African coast, particularly in the early days. And of course, it was Europeans who started to say, no, actually, we need labor to work on our plantations. And it's black Africans who said, right, if you want labor, we will give you that labor.
So you start to get an idea of a huge interconnected system, African internal politics and economics, connecting with British trade interests. Still, even though the situation was complicated and interconnected, it doesn't excuse any one person's involvement, nor make the moral issues any less clear-cut. The fundamental wrongness of slavery remains undeniable.
Certainly reading people like Professor David Olusoga. In his book Black and British, which was published, I think, in about 2016, he talks about how the Europeans in going to West Africa, it's not about the issues of they're subhuman, therefore we'd use them. It's in trading with them, they realized that there was a supply of labor which could be used. And then you realize later, as they were used, so from the Enlightenment period, you start to see a scientific justification for enslaved Africans being inferior, and then that sets in from the 19th century, but it doesn't date it from the first period.
This was a really big shift for me because it brought it back to commerce again. It started off as your basic supply and demand principles of economics, and I'm guessing consumers were kind of sucked in because they lacked information about what was really happening. So as demand increased, plantation owners got more desperate and ruthless in their practices and searched for ways to convince themselves that their actions were acceptable.
Again, in studying the subject, it was evident for me that there was a historic conflict between commerce, trade and morality. And the question of morality came up in 2017 when the question of the Colston Hall was going to be renamed. The announcement was made by Bristol Music Trust, and the question of morality came up, whereby local politician Mark Wright said in the Bristol Post, "We cannot judge Colston by a modern context, because at the time Colston was alive, mainstream saw nothing wrong with slavery and the slave trade." Now that was his comment which was made. Very plausible to, I would suggest, to many Bristolians. And at first sight, to listen to it, I said, okay, it's a common thing said. It's a thing of their time, yeah, which is commonly said as a defense. They had a different morality at that time. But is that a correct statement? And I wanted to investigate that.
To investigate, Rob looked further into records of the time and what was being said about the slave trade. Rob focused his research on the generations before, during and after the time when the slave trade was at its height in Bristol. This was also the time when the abolition movement was at its height.
By the time we get to the 1770s, 1780s, 1780s is the start of the abolition movement, 1770s, 1780s, the height of Britain's participation in the transatlantic slave trade. I wanted to ask the question then, what did ordinary people think about slavery and the slave trade? For most ordinary people in Britain, unless they worked as sailors on the Middle Passage, unless they worked as overseers on the British plantations in the English Caribbean, for most ordinary people, they would not have seen the realities of the slave trade in Britain. It would have been largely out of sight, out of mind, because by 1770, about estimated 15,000 Africans in Britain. Most of them were all in London. Most all enslaved servants of the rich, the wealthy. Aristocracy, gentry, royal family, and wealthy merchants. So they would have been dressed in their finery. So the realities of the slave trade would not have been particularly evident to ordinary people. And because of that, when the abolition movement started, the leaders of the abolition movement, so Thomas Clarkson, Granville Sharp, that's why they concentrated on informing and educating ordinary people as to the realities of the slave trade. And it was done by particularly Thomas Clarkson, public meetings, but pictorial evidence. The Brooks slave ship, which was a Liverpool-owned ship, there's a pictorial evidence of the ship from 1788, which showed how Africans were compacted on the ship during transportation. So this pictorial evidence, books, pamphlets, all were about informing and educating ordinary people. And as ordinary people became informed, so many of them were revolted by it. Mm-hmm. They were informed and educated, again the key. Educated women drinking their tea in the afternoon with slave-produced sugar. British poets, William Cowper, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, concentrated their poetry directed at middle-class women drinking their tea in the afternoon, sweetened and taken and sweetened with slave-produced sugar. So it was about contesting the use of sugar. A Quaker called William Fox, in his publication addressed to the people of Great Britain. It was a publication which was circulated all around Britain in 1791 as part of the abolition movement. But in it, he stated, if we consume the commodity being sugar, yes, you participate in the crime.
Absolutely.
Really contemporary. This is 1791. That could have been said now. As educated women became informed, it had an effect. And because in 1791, when the first bill to abolish the slave trade failed in Parliament, later that year, the first mass boycott of the purchase of slave-produced sugar. And again, driven by women. And they did it in a very real way, despite having no political power, because they controlled the purse strings in the home. So women. So what did educated men who owned plantations feel? What did they think about slavery and the slave trade? And there's a very good quote from this book called Blood Legacy and Reckoning with the Family Story of Slavery. So he's talking about his family and trying to address his family history or come to terms with it. In it he says, Robert Dallas arrived in Jamaica from Scotland in 1779 to take charge of his dead father's debt-laden estate. Initially, the 25-year-old found the whole business and the, quote, rapacious, inhuman, ignorant and cruel, unquote, white people in charge of it revolting. And he goes on to say, as time went on though, Dallas felt he was becoming inured to, so accustomed to the, quote, tyranny, cruelty, murder, unquote, that he saw. Quote, there is a kind of intoxication. I've not lost my natural abhorrence to cruelty, yet I see it practiced with much less impatience than I did, and I have only to pray that I may not feel an inclination to turn slave driver myself, unquote. By the time he was middle-aged, he had abandoned much of his anti-slavery ardour. He held on to the plantation till 1810. Quote, I was young and intoxicated with the utopian ideas of liberty, unquote. He wrote to excuse his early qualms. What was the point, he asked, in questioning a system that makes people so rich? Wow. What was the point, he asked, in questioning a system that makes people so rich? For many plantation owners, they were absentee landlords. They didn't go out to the plantation. They never saw the reality of plantation life. So this person, Robert Dallas, as a young man, inherited an estate, and he saw the realities of it. He was revolted by it. But over a period of time, he became inured to what he saw because he profited from it. So they understood the immorality, but they chose to benefit from it and therefore continue with what they saw as abhorrent or evil. And that has a great takeover, if you like, to the modern world to learn from. So when people talk about it's a thing of their time, it's a way of excusing evil or wrongful acts in our past on the basis that they didn't know anything better. I don't think that's an acceptable way to interrogate history.
I totally agree. Such excuses not only dismiss the idea of personal moral agency, it also overlooks the voices of those who resisted and suffered under the system. It's more accurate and honest to acknowledge that people made choices to encourage slavery to benefit themselves despite knowing it was wrong.
So one such person is Edward Colston. He's about to become the centre of our story.
But we'll give him that position reluctantly, because he's not the main character and he doesn't deserve our sympathy or admiration. However, his story is a good example of how things happened in the past, and his memory has played a crucial role in setting modern events into motion.
If you want to understand Bristol and this subject, you need to understand Colston. Edward Colston, slave trader, 1636, 1721. Colston is a hugely divisive figure in Bristol, hugely divisive. Now, So a little bit about him to understand him first, and then I'll talk about what happened in 2017. Edward Colston was born in Bristol in 1636 in an area called Temple. He was the eldest son of, they believe, 11 children. His father, William Colston, was a merchant in Bristol, importing wine and sugar. William Colston, the father, was also a royalist. Now, the royalists were defeated in the English Civil War. William, the father, loses all his positions in Bristol. He takes his family to London. So Edward Colston grows up in London. We know he follows his father into business. We know from records he exported cloth to mainland Europe, and he imported, amongst other things, wine into England. But importantly, in 1680, he becomes a member of the Royal African Company. He holds official position on their governing body. Now, in 1681, the father, William, dies in Bristol. Edward Colston comes back to Bristol for a short period. He himself becomes a member of the Society of Merchant Ventures, which enables him to trade out of Bristol using the ships of his deceased father. And those official positions culminate in his appointment as Deputy Governor of the Royal African Company in 1689, number 2 behind the King. He's Deputy Governor of the English slave trade as operated by the monopoly of the Royal African Company behind the King. So he's not a small player. Now, between 1680 and 1692, the Royal African Company transports about 84,000 enslaved Africans, of which about 19,000 die during transportation. So from a factual point of view, Edward Colston has their blood on his hands.
Okay, so he's obviously a big player in the slave trade, and now he's using Bristol ships and Bristol's harbour. He's obviously making a lot of money for himself and for other people. But he's not the only one.
If you go into off the South Transept, there's a monument to Eleanor and Thomas Daniel. They were from Barbados, they were white, and their son, also Thomas Daniel, born in 1762, brought to Bristol by his parents at the age of 2, so 1764. He became one of the foremost sugar merchants in Bristol. He had 50 years on the council. He became so wealthy and powerful, he was known as the King of Bristol. But importantly, in the 1830s, when the bill to abolish slavery in most of the British colonies went through Parliament, 1833, became law August 1834, and then it took 4 years, August 1838, when enslaved Africans were able to walk off the plantations in the English Caribbean. So 4 years to come into effect. But in August 1838, approximately 800,000 enslaved in our colonies, so not just the Caribbean, were freed. But the British government set aside £20 million to compensate former slave owners. So not former enslaved, but former slave owners. So £20 million. Now, Professor David Olusoga comments that this is equivalent to £17 billion. Lot of money. That all then became part of the national debt, only just paid off as part of the national debt in 2015. So that money to compensate former slave owners. Now, Thomas Daniel in the 1830s received compensation from the British government for slave compensation, and he was the highest recipient of slave compensation monies in Bristol. But it is amazing that for someone who was the highest recipient of slave compensation monies in Bristol, and I've guided hundreds of people, so the vast majority of people just never heard of him. Yeah, everyone knows Colston, never heard of Thomas Daniel. Now, why is that? Well, the one thing straight away stands out: Thomas Daniel was not a philanthropist, and this is the issue. So when people received compensation, slave compensation monies in the 1830s from the British government, a lot of that money was reinvested by those who received the money into the infrastructure in Britain, particularly our railways. And here in Bristol, into the infrastructure, which were all Brunel projects. So some of them invested their monies in the Clifton Suspension Bridge, into the SS Great Britain, both Brunel projects, and the Great Western Railway from London to Bristol, which was built by Brunel 1836 to 1841. The investment came from people who had direct involvement in the slave economy, who profited from it, who were then reinvesting into infrastructure or investments as they saw as they saw would probably be profitable in Bristol. Our earliest bank in Bristol was 1750, the Bristol Bank, just after the period when Bristol had been the premier slaving port, so directly connected with the triangular trade. Our first fire insurance company in Bristol was 1718, Bristol Crown Fire Office. And Bristol Crown Fire Office insured our sugar houses, which had a habit of going up in flames. From our fire insurance companies in Britain, we get our fire brigades in Britain. So there's interconnectivity with another subject. So for many of our institutions in Britain have their starting point in the slave trade period, or like marine insurance, expanded greatly in the slave trade period. And other organisations, our universities, Oxford, Cambridge, our churches, cathedrals, our mansion houses in London, Bristol, Liverpool and Glasgow, potentially all have direct links with the transatlantic slave trade. So if we're going to understand our present, we have to understand our past.
As Rob said, there are many other people, some big players in British society, who have benefited from the slave trade, but who never made their way into the history books.
So how did Edward Colston end up getting a bigger role in this story than he deserves?
To answer that, we're going to head down to see the plinth where his statue used to stand.
Now we go down to the Colston plinth. This is hugely important, but the plaque erected by citizens of Bristol, untrue, misstatement. What that means is erected by public subscription. Now there was a tiny subscription by the public which went towards the funding of the statue as a memorial of one of the most virtuous and wise sons of their city, AD 1895. Yeah. What it is saying is he's a nice bloke, he's a good bloke. And if you see the statue of Colston, it's a very considered pose. Now unusually for a statue, it says nothing about the person.
Yeah, that's
absolutely true. Nothing. If you go to National Trust houses in Britain, you'll normally have reference to West India merchant or East India merchant, which in itself is very vague. If you're West India merchant, you could be a slave trader. Yeah. You could be a sugar merchant, a tobacco merchant. This says nothing about him, right, other than the considered pose, which says he's very considered, he's considerate, he's kind, he looks after people, and it fits what they wanted at the time, AD 1895, which was to project him or promote him as a great philanthropist. In the middle of the 1690s, he starts to donate monies to Bristol. He builds an almshouse called Colston's Almshouse on St. Michael's Hill. In 1710, he founds his first school in Bristol called Colston Hospital. Colston Hospital originally was for 100 poor boys. 1711, he then he funded a second school in Bristol called Temple School for Boys, a school for orphan boys. He then carries on donating monies to schools, to churches, to almshouses in Bristol. And then in 1721, he dies in Mortlake in Surrey. When he dies, he bequeaths £171,000, massive sum of money. £100,000 goes to relatives, nephews, nieces, cousins. The remaining £71,000 to public charities, as I understand it, largely the schools to which he's related or concerned. When he dies, he also decrees that every year on his birthday, the 13th of November, which later becomes known as Colston Day, he decrees that a sermon be held in his memory with his schoolboys present at Bristol Cathedral. And that's celebrated in Bristol, I believe, up until probably about 15 years ago. So he's already set in place his self-memorialisation after his death. Within 5 years of his death, 4 societies founded in Bristol to honour and respect the name of Colston. The Colston Society, the Dolphin Society, those are meant to be dolphins, it's part of his coat of arms. Okay. The Grateful Society and the Anchor Society were all founded in order, or they become vehicles for raising money for the poor. Now, his birth date, the 13th of November, Colston Day, by the middle of the 19th century had become very ritualised in Bristol. So you had processions by his schoolboys, church services with his schoolboys present, dinners held by those 4 societies. So if you were a president of one of those 4 societies, very prestigious post to hold in Bristol.
So he made his name known during his life and after his death. But he wasn't the only philanthropist or local hero of Bristol. I'm sure there were local heroes whose money and actions were less morally challenging. So why was the statue built in the first place?
So the next question we ask is, why was Colston chosen in Bristol to celebrate as a great philanthropist? Why was he chosen? To better understand it, I again went to Dr. Richard Stone, and he said that there were two events which happened in Bristol which led to Colston being chosen to promote. One of which was that from about 1850 we had accidents involving longer ships in Bristol in the River Avon in the Avon Gorge, with the result that we started to develop Avonmouth docks, and because it was located outside of Bristol, there was a perception that Bristol as a port would start to lose its identity as a port, so a loss of identity. But the second most important event was that in the late 1880s, early 1890s, there was serious labour unrest in Bristol. And with the serious labour unrest in Bristol, the elite in Bristol wanted to find a way of uniting the different classes to bring them together. And an option that they thought was to find a city father from Bristol's past, which might help bring the classes together. Now, there are a number of people that Bristol could have chosen, but the majority of whom would not have been known by most of the Bristol population. By 1850, however, sections of the Bristol population would have known the name of Colston 130 years after his death. So he was, if you like, a ready-made package. Yeah. He fitted what they wanted, which was that he was a philanthropic businessman from Bristol's past. And it fitted in with the current crop of philanthropic businessmen in Bristol, the Wills Tobacco family, the Fry's chocolate family. Right. So it provided this link tradition, a link from the past. But in order to promote him, as Mark Steeds and Roger Ball say in their book, From Wolfstand to Colston, he was promoted as a moral saint and a merchant prince. But to promote him as such, the elite in Bristol had to set aside his direct links with the English slave trade. So Britain's distancing itself from the slave trade, saying we abolished slavery in most of the British colonies in 1833. Here in Bristol, we promote someone. Right to the heart of the English slave trade from the 1680s. But to do so, the only way they could do so was to silence, so sanitize his past, to set aside his background and connections with the English slave trade. So the elite in Bristol in the late 19th century, the late Victorian period, not only sanitized Colston's past, as evidenced by the plaque, but also set aside Bristol's participation in the English slave trade. Right. So education in Bristol. I went to school just outside of Bristol with my twin brother. I played Colston School many times at sport. I had no idea who Colston was. I received no education on Bristol's participation in the slave trade, on Britain's participation in the slave trade, nor of Colston's participation in the English slave trade. I had no idea who he was. And even if I wanted to find out, I had no idea of the statue of Colston. And even if I knew of the statue, of course, the plaque would have told me nothing about it. So we start to see from the late Victorian period, Bristolians grow up to honour and respect Colston as a great philanthropist, full stop. And then to cement this in the psyche of Bristolians, you start to see the physical memorialisation of Colston from this period. So Colston Hall, 1867. Colston Street on which it stands, 1870. All where the buses are, that's Colston Avenue, 1892. Colston Girls' School, 1891 on Cheltenham Road. Stained glass window, north transept, Bristol Cathedral. South aisle of Bristol, the nave of Bristol Cathedral, 1920, Edward Colston. Gosh. This building here, 1973, when it was built, right. Colston Tower. Okay, this way. We are still memorialising Colston in 1973. But that's why, when in early 2017, Bristol Music Trust, who managed the Colston Hall on behalf of the owners Bristol Council, announced at the end of 2020, we will rename the Colston Hall. And Colston will be removed from the name because we no longer want the name of a known slave trader on the side of a public building. But of course, the announcement in early 2017 caused a furore in Bristol. Absolute furore.
So you may have noticed that we've said the word statue several times, but there isn't actually one there. To find out what happened to it, where it is now, and why it's so important of the Bristol of today, join us in part 2 of our tour with Rob. He's going to talk us through post-2017, the fracas in Bristol, and why everything we've learnt about the past is so relevant today.
So click subscribe and hit the notification bell to join us there.
Until then,
Happy travels, everyone!